All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So, welcome everyone to the seventh episode of the Voices of QLF webinar series. Excited to have you all here today. I think this actually is the second highest number of registrants that we've had for our series so far. So, that's really great to see some continued interest. We have a number of guests, wonderful guests who are going to be joining us today. Some of the first QLF interns who had joined us on the Quebec North Shore and the northern peninsula of Newfoundland. So this is a fun episode for me as well, as I was able to intern for QLF for 2 summers back in high school and college in some of those very same areas. So I was in Harrington Harbor, Quebec, and traveling between Conch, Newfoundland and Labrador, working for Candy Cochrane, who's going to be joining us today as well. So I am going to be sharing throughout this episode a number of photos as folks are presenting. And if any of the attendees would like to access any of those photos or have photos of their own that you're interested in sharing with QLF, we encourage you to reach out to any of the staff members, or you're welcome to email us at qlf@qlf.org to request photos or share yours. So that would be great. You'll also see at the bottom of your screen there is a chat feature, and you're welcome to add in any comments or questions that you have for the panelists today, and I'll be sharing those with everyone after the episode. So enjoy, and I will now hand it off to QLF President Beth Alling.
Thank you, Alex, for hosting this series and for bringing alumni and friends together in our home region and traveling across the globe and back once more. Welcome to all, and especially our webinar guests, who are some of the first volunteers in the 1960s. They have served with QLF over consecutive summers, traveling to the once remote communities along the Quebec North Shore and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, and over to southern Labrador. And in later years, several have joined QLF's governing boards and staff. Remarkably, these alumni have been steadfast in their commitment to QLF over 6 decades. Now I'd like to ask our guests to unmute their video and mics. It is a great privilege and honor to introduce Philip Nadeau, Chairman, Board of Directors, QLF Canada, Clare McMorris, Chair, Board of Directors, QLF US, Ed Miller, Vice Chairman, Board of Directors, QLF US, Larry Morris, President Emeritus, Richard Berlin, Honorary Director, Candace Cochrane, former staff member and photographer, and Bill Dennett, volunteer icon, serving with QLF over several summers. Pioneers in their own right, these volunteers accepted the mantle of leadership of QLF founder Bob Bryan, Bush Pilot and Anglican Minister, who held an affinity for the people of the remote rural communities in what is now QLF's home region. Bob Bryan held a deep conviction that a new generation of young leaders could reach the hearts and minds, inspire and lead to make a difference in the lives of many, and ultimately theirs as well. In this episode, we'll look back in time with a behind-the-scenes review of QLF's first community service work, pivotal in the organization's evolution with its roots in community. In retrospect, the decade of the 60s may be defined by the values and ideals represented by Bob Bryan and his cadre of hundreds of volunteers, and over the years that has formed the fundamental tenets and philosophy of this organization. QLF's platform, originally and solely focused on community and service, now includes broader dimensions of community, conservation, and stewardship, the hallmarks of an enduring platform that has brought us to our 60th anniversary. And now I'd like to ask Larry Morris to provide a brief overview of the early years in the 1960s to set the context for this webinar.
Thank you, Beth. And I'm one of the few that has a two-way camera. It's a really great turnout, big crowd out there today as we go back to our roots. So there won't be a puppet show, sadly. QLF is often described as a community-based conservation organization. That's today. We were one of the first, in fact, to carry that banner. In today's webinar, we're going to explore our past and focus on that community base. For the many alumni on this webinar, please recognize that it is you who got us here, so this program today is dedicated to all of you. Back in February, alumnus Bill Dennett, with us on this webinar, wrote a letter to me which inspired Beth and her staff to action. I'd like to share, with his permission, part of what Bill wrote. As I read Bill's reminiscences, we'll scroll some photos in the background so that the words come even more alive. In fact, we'll do that throughout the webinar today, as Alex said earlier. I will conclude my remarks by saying something briefly about each of our guests so that you know how fortunate we are to have these QLF luminaries among us. Enjoy their stories. I sure will. And now it is on to the Bill Dennett letter. I begin, quote, "Your letter of February 4th, Larry, brought back some 57 years to an early evening, late winter Choate Chapel service in the final trimester of my 6th form year. When you wrote that while pursuing your new career as an archivist at QLF, you had discovered that Choate figured large in QLF's inception. I found myself back in chapel listening, something I did rarely after 5 years of daily chapel, to Bob Bryan describe his time as an Anglican supply priest in a parish that stretched out along the North Shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the coast. His appearance was a welcome event for the 550 boys who made up the Choate student body. Bob, known to us as Bear, after Bear Bryant, legendary Alabama football coach, had made and co-starred in a best-selling recording of regional folk humor, Bert and I. He flew, sometimes very low over the Choate campus, a single-engine float plane with the iconic ID 69 Easy. His chapel talks, much more often than not, were a wondrous combination of entertainment, provocative topics, and speed. Supper directly followed chapel. Bear spent the first part of that evening's service so long ago describing the adventures he and his young family experienced in the North. We were all transfixed by what he told us about flying along that roadless coast in all sorts of seemingly impossible weather to accomplish noble things. Then he told us about what the 6 to 8 Choaties who had accompanied him to the coast for a few summers did, teaching youngsters up there to play sports and learn to swim. His pronation took the form of a challenge to the 6th formers, us, to apply to become part of an expanded program to take place that coming summer, 1964. So I did. How astonishingly naive we were. Off to follow a charismatic boarding school chaplain into a part of the world not all that well settled to spew out undefined good. Most of us were 17 to 19 years old. All of us were from a certain background, with little to no functional knowledge of the world's needs or how to meet those needs. But for all that, we did what we signed up to do, more or less, and in so doing, brought a little good to the folks we lived and worked with. I know they gave us a good deal more than we did or could give them or their kids. Bill finished this letter back a few months ago by saying this: how about pulling together the stories of those first volunteers before we drift too much further into our dotage? An extended early oral history, perhaps? Well, now, Bill, thank you for expressing your thoughts. Your wish begins to be answered with this webinar in our 60th anniversary year. I now turn to our guest today to pick up where Beth left off earlier. Bill Dennett. You already know Bill now through his letter. I just want to add that back in the 1970s, after his QLF experience, he was head of what is known as the QLF Alumni Association. How about Clare? Clare McMorris. Clare was Faith Bryan's cousin and the first woman volunteer in 1962. She's maintained an active involvement with the organization ever since and now chairs the QLF US board. Philip Nadeau. Philip has been involved with Bob Bryan since he was convinced, I think that's the word, in the 1960s to leave his home in St. Paul's River, Quebec, and journey to Wallingford, Connecticut to complete high school. Today, Philip chairs the QLF Canada board. There's a long and, let's say, captivating story in between. Ed Miller. One of the Fort Choate alumni on the webinar today. He has been involved with this organization since high school. Ed is really Bob's protege and continues to serve as pastor to the entire Bryan family. Richard. Richard came to QLF in the late 1970s as Bob's handpicked director of development, the first to ever serve in that position. As such, Richard single-handedly reconnected with hundreds of QLF alumni who had once served in our home region and sadly had drifted away. It was Richard who brought them back. And Candace. No, she did not go to Choate. You will live forever, however, in infamy as the person who first introduced me to this organization. That was back in 1975. Besides owning a home in Conch, Newfoundland, a community to which she was unable to return last summer for the first time in 4 decades, Candy is an accomplished photographer, author, and researcher. She has a new book coming out on Labrador. Just a personal note, all our friends, all our guests are friends, and yes, I admittedly am the rookie among them. I didn't start until 75. This webinar is a tribute to all of our early volunteers. We owe them, you, a huge debt of thanks. It is you, our alumni, who paved the way for all that follows. So there you have it. And Beth, I think it's now back to you.
Thank you so much, Larry. And thank you, Bill, for reaching out to us. And now we have a wonderful 2-minute video clip of a film produced by Ed Miller years ago, which captures QLF in the early years. The film clip with Bob Bryan's voiceover begins in the heart of our home region, Harrington Harbor on the Quebec North Shore. Over to you, Alex.
We're flying over Harrington Harbor, one of the isolated communities of the North Shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. These and other villages in Newfoundland and Labrador were settled in the 19th century by fishermen, men who were willing to endure extreme hardships because of the abundance of codfish, the salmon, and the fur seal. Harrington is 800 miles east of Montreal and the same distance northeast of Boston. But no roads connect Harrington to larger cities. And the only access to it and other towns is by air and sea. Fishing traditionally has been the primary occupation in Harrington. For more than 10 years, educational projects have been created to help prepare the people to adapt to the changes that are coming in future years. Supplementing the provincial education program are day camps which emphasize the importance of people working together. The people of Harrington Harbor and other towns in this region must be able to face a harsh environment and build communities that give fulfillment to themselves, their children, and their children's children.
Wonderful film. Thank you, Ed, for providing that to us. Great to have that. Ed, I'd like to turn to you to comment on this film and its significance in QLF's history.
Well, thanks, Beth. I think that the film, which of course was conceived by Bob in the early 70s, was an attempt after just about 10 years or 11 years to try to encapsulate and distill the very beginnings. It was, by his design, focused through Harrington Harbor, not to be exclusive about that, but because we basically didn't have the resources to go all over the place and find every town nor the storyline to do that, but rather a way of using that as an example of the initial purpose of QLF, and also to give a little flavor, which we didn't have time to show in these clips today, a little more of a flavor for what life was like on the coast with the fishing and that sort of thing. So it was a way to encapsulate 10 years after the beginning, roughly 10 years, some of the spirit of the founding from which everything else, both geographically and in time, emerged.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And now let's move on to the early years or return to the early years of QLF. And I'd like to call upon a few of you to tell us what was appealing to you about this organization, why you joined as a volunteer. And do we have any volunteers for that, or should I call upon perhaps Philip Nadeau?
Thank you, Beth. I was not an early volunteer, actually, because I was recruited, if that's the right word, one of the words you used, about Bob Bryan. I met him in 1963, and Harrington looked much like Ed's film, his and Ed's film, in the summer. But I spent the full year there going to school. I had to leave St. Paul's River because they didn't go beyond the 8th grade there. And so that's what I was doing in Harrington. And it had looked a lot different in the winter, believe me. But that was a great year. It was one of the first years that I left home. And so that was a bit of a break-even year for me in terms, or a break-in year, I should say, for me in terms of being away from home. I got over my homesickness. I stayed with Grenfell Osborne and his family, and the pond in front of our house was one of the first places where we built a skating rink. So this was long before some of these pictures, or not long before, but certainly before some of these pictures. And it was a great place to be.
Wonderful. And I'd like to turn this to Clare McMorris. Being Faith's cousin, I'm sure there was a direct connection with Bob Bryan and QLF, but can you tell us what was appealing to you about QLF at the time?
Well, Bob wanted to see whether or not girls would work, and I was an experiment. You know, frankly, a cousin is expendable. But we were the second year that they had volunteers up there, and I've cudgeled the brains of Tom Lathrop and Nat Benchley, who were with me, and we don't really remember being recruited. We remember thinking what a great idea it would be to go. We had no idea what we were going to do, except we were going to try and set up systems to play with, to have the children learn how to play. And we were given no instruction. Bob was flying around most of the time, and I'm amazed to see we went from 3 of us, replaced by 3 of us that summer, to that group of in 1968. And I don't know how Bob did that, but it was just amazing. All I can say is we did something right. I had to teach the girls how to sew. Did I know how to sew? I learned how to sew with them. We took the kids up to Harrington. There was a pond at the top by the hospital, and they went swimming there. Now they have a swimming pool. But we started the swimming program there. The boys created some kind of a soccer field. And so that's the beginning of some of those other tapes you're seeing. But it was an amazing, special summer that stayed with me all of my life.
Thanks so much. And now I'd like to turn to Candy and tell me what it was like for you as a CFA, a come from away, something we've heard a lot about from each of our panelists here.
Well, the summer before I went, I'd had a great adventure with my best friend, Louise Knapp, crossing the country by car and having a wild time. And we sort of said, well, what are we going to do next summer? And we found out about the program, signed up. It was going to be very quaint little fishing villages. And when we got to orientation, we met our leader, Bill Dennett, who said, you're not going to any little fishing village. You're going to a lumber town. And the people are evangelical Christians, and it's a bit different. So, hey, okay. So we got there, and it was different. And there were 5 of us. And we had to learn about people whose life was really determined by their church experience and their church going. And it was wonderful, completely different than both what we expected and certainly where we came from.
Wonderful. Richard, would you like to comment on your experience as a CFA?
I love listening, Beth, to Bill Dennett's letter, because also being a former Chody, Bob Bryan's chapel talks were probably the only ones I paid remotely any attention to. And he painted such a romantic notion about this experience we might partake of, helping these people in the north and teaching them how to swim. And I remember, a few days before I took off to fly up there, my father gave me this wonderful piece of advice. He says, now you're going to change the world up there, boy, you're going to help people. Well, I think most of us would agree. When I arrived on the ferry coming across from Newfoundland to Blanc-Sablon, filled with Catholics and French speakers, which is why I think I was chosen to go to that town, I saw icebergs floating in offshore. And I said, we're going to teach kids how to swim in this? Uh-oh. I was used to a heated pool as a child, and this seemed totally unacceptable. But I think just to encapsulate my experience, like so many others, we went up there with a certain sense of expectation and what we could do to help and change people's lives. And as we all imagine, those of us who went there, they did more to change ours than we ever did to change theirs. And that's what I remember about it. It was my first brush with humility and the expanse of a bigger world and people different than I. God, what a couple of summers they were.
Well, thanks so much. And Bill Dennett, you mentioned something very similar, that you took away so much more than you felt you ever gave. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, glad to. But before I go too far, I want to remind Candy that she and Louise demanded that they go wherever they went, that they had to go together, and they were the only. And I needed 2 women to fill out to round out my group for Roddick and Newfoundland, and they were the only 2 that would not be separate. So that's how they ended up in a lumber town as opposed to an isolated fishing village. And it was the best choice ever made. Gosh, the last 10 days of thinking about getting ready for this and thinking about Newfoundland and the North Shore of Quebec, of St. Lawrence, Gulf of St. Lawrence, it's been a trip down memory lane like I have not didn't think possible. I guess there's a couple things I want to say, but first, I was up there 3 summers, and I was lucky enough to spend time both on the North Shore and in the Northern Peninsula. I saw both sides, and for me, coming from an academic family in New Haven, Connecticut, and having spent a lot of time in boarding school, to find myself in a place so very different than anything I'd ever seen before was exhilarating and nervous making and a challenge, and it was exciting. And gosh, I still think about all that time with fondness and some amazement that that I survived. And anyway, it was. I want to hear what other people also felt as a result of having looked back after 57 years now. Wow, 57 years.
And you had referred to the very fragile way of life and threatened way of life in those years, but also mentioned the incredible hospitality you felt in your years up there. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So without exception, every village, town that I worked in or lived in or visited, I found the folks there to be remarkably open and generous in ways that I had never experienced before in my life. That was an eye-opener of some importance for me.
If I may, I agree with that, because when I landed in Kagaska, I really didn't know what was expected. And the whole town sort of absorbed me and Tom and Nat and made us a part of their lives, from everything from going to the ice house to anything that was going on in town. And when I went to Kagaska, even though I was staying at the parsonage, I had the same sense. As oddly enough, my son went to Harrington, God knows how many years later, and he had the same experience. So it's basically something which is innate to those people, which was just great.
Yeah, and I will say one other thing. Because I spent time both in the North Shore and in a very, very different place called Roddington, which was moving from Old Fort Bay my second summer at the drop of a hat, and finding myself living in a nursing station, the Grenfell pocket hospital, really. And although the community was completely different than Harrington and Old Fort, the people were, again, without exception, accepting and remarkably helpful, despite the divisions that existed in the town that were quite real. Candy, do they still exist up there, those same divisions that we had?
Well, people have gone away and come back, and it's different, but certainly the hospitality remains. But our experience in Roddington I think was quite different. The culture was different. I think it was not people came from many different places in Newfoundland and Labrador to work in a lumber mill. It was a company town, so to speak. And I think that I learned so many lessons in the first week, things that I didn't expect, didn't understand. I mean, I guess this was the second summer I was there. I had a camera and I was taking pictures of everything. And someone came and said, well, this young mother has just passed away and has 9 kids or something. And could you come up into the church and take a picture? Okay, had no idea what that meant. And so I just showed up at the church with my camera. Everybody was staring at me. I was staring at them. And there was no instructions. So I went up to the open casket lined up the family behind it, took a picture, oh my God, and walked out. And it was, that doesn't happen in Darien, Connecticut, I can tell you. And it was just one lesson after another, all of them, I'd say probably a better education than I ever got in boarding school. That's for sure. And I was blessed to be part of it.
And Beth, may I make a comment? The early volunteers who came to St. Paul's River and Salmon Bay, what I remember about them is that Bob must have done the front end work, or he had somebody do the front end work. But it's amazing when you think of, the size of the homes up there, and everybody basically having a big family, and then they're being asked to take in a couple of volunteers for the summer, who were not necessarily small guys, all of them, or small women, all of them, but to be integrated into their family was amazing. And the other thing that I thought was classic on those first volunteers who came to Salmon Bay was they were put up. Hollis Cates was a merchant in town, and so his store was a place, obviously, that was nice and dry. And he put up the volunteers in his twine loft, which is not a bad place because it smells good and it's dry, and you could get a good night's sleep. But they had tents up in his twine loft. That's where they spent the summer.
I remember, Philip and all of you, I remember my second summer, I lived with a fairly affluent family in Lourdes-du-Blanc-Sablon. And my second summer, which was the summer I got to watch the lunar moon landing from rabbit ear antennas, I don't know where the signal came to Blanc-Sablon. You guys would know, somewhere in Newfoundland across the straits. But you could barely make it out, and there was snow. And of course, Antoine Jones says, "No, Dick boy, you can't believe that. That's all actors, no, that could never happen." But my second summer, they had a toilet in their house. And people in the village used to come to their house to check out the toilet. But there was only one problem with the toilet. It didn't flush. So while they had the toilet, we had to go carry water from the spring in the Javex bottles and the lard buckets, the tender flake buckets, on the frame, and seat them by the toilet so it would flush. And I do recall they did not have what we would all characterize as a septic system in those days.
It's interesting how that didn't matter, did it?
No.
It just, I don't know, it didn't really make that much of a difference. It seems like when I was home and my mother said, "Well, would you do this? Take out the garbage?" And I go, "Oh my God, why?" But you get up there, you do a million chores, and you're carrying buckets and you're doing this and that. It didn't seem to matter.
Well, in the volunteers learning more than they ever, extended to the residents of these communities, on my day off, I get to go out with Alphonse Jones and go fishing for the day in his one lunger, and whether it was jigging or cod traps. One day we caught a hood seal, which is a very prized seal pelt. And he made it my project to build the frame, to strip the gut, to lace up the seal. And then he helped me shave the fat off when it sat in the sun to dry out, so I didn't screw it up. I mean, these were amazing experiences. Yeah, maybe we helped a couple of kids learn how to swim, or taught them, games like Duck, Duck, Goose, or stuff they hadn't seen. But, you took your eyes off them for a minute, and you had 9-year-old boys in the hockey rink in the summer throwing stones at a badger who's up against the wall. These were, gosh, they were such tough kids.
Yeah.
A question to you guys: why teach swimming in places like the ones you're describing? can you address that? Because I think there are people on this webinar that will probably have that question in their mind. Why swimming?
I know why we started. We started because they lived on Harrington is an island. And even though one of the reasons that they really didn't know how to swim was the water was so bloody cold, as the French, as Richard said, that there wasn't much chance of surviving a very long time. But there was some chance of surviving if they knew how to swim or knew how to get onto a dory or whatever. And it was, the young boys took to it like ducks to water. It was freezing cold up there, but they were determined to learn how to swim. And we probably weren't very good swimming instructors, but we knew how to swim, and they learned. They wanted to learn.
Yeah, we were told stories about how men would fall off the sides of those open boats and couldn't get back on. Couldn't swim the couple of strokes to get to the edge of the boat. In fact, my second year, the week or so that I spent in Old Fort Bay, the first night, a radio call came into the house that I was staying in that someone had fallen off the boat and drowned. They wanted to know if myself or the person that I was sharing a tent with knew anything about how to revive people. That only served to reinforce the notion that teaching kids how to even swim a few strokes, was pretty damn important.
Yeah,
but
Bill,
I'm not sure we actually did a hell of a lot. That was the idea.
just as we think in our culture as duct tape is the fix-all, I remember in Blossabla, it was Javex, like Clorox bleach bottles. You could cut the top off and use them to bail a boat. You could screw the caps on and attach them to lines and make fishing lanes or enclosures for the pool. We strung them up with lines and got all the cod fishermen to take 2 of them with a line in their boat, because it was easy to get a hold of, and God forbid the boat capsized, they could throw their arms over the lines and the buoyancy of the 2 Javex bottles would at least keep them afloat. So maybe they had, some resource or some chance of getting back to their craft.
I would also add, Larry, that drowning was a real problem up there. I mean, it was one of the few reasons for people to lose their lives, obviously. And if the cold water didn't get you, the mosquitoes would in certain places. So it's a bit surprising that Bob chose that, to learn how to swim was going to be worthwhile. And I can relate to this subject just because I had a brother who was duck hunting with a friend late in the fall, and they made the mistake of being in a place where a shoal breaks. If it's, if the sea is coming in and it's not a big sea, it only breaks periodically. And there were 2 of them in the boat, and unfortunately they got either distracted or whatever, probably distracted by the ducks. But they came too close to a breaking wave and they were tossed out of the boat. And unfortunately, my brother, who was 21 at the time, died. If he could have swum, I don't know that would have saved his life. He got hit and probably knocked out. But his friend, in all fairness, his friend who was with him in the boat did survive. So you never know.
Yeah.
I think it was the #1 priority for the mothers too. I mean, I think Bob asked them what would you like our volunteers to do, is to teach our children to swim. And Bob, I think, made that pretty clear to us that was a priority. And as Dick said, some of the places we had to teach kids to swim were, I don't know, Bill, if you remember Muddy Hole, but it's kind of like, gee, I guess we're gonna have to wear shoes because there's glass all over here, and but the kids didn't mind. I mean, the kid, some ways people were pretty cavalier given the fact that they couldn't swim. The kids in the spring would be jumping from ice pan to ice pan, and the fishermen would jump from boat to boat, and I don't, I would have been terrified, but they couldn't swim, and they just, I don't know. How can you explain that, Philip? That people just kind of went on. They didn't seem to be afraid.
Yeah, I'm not sure that cavalier is the right word, but I think that they certainly were fairly adept in their environment. Everybody learned to jump from one ice pan to another in the spring when the ice broke up. So you had some practice doing that. Some people made mistakes, obviously, along the way.
Yeah.
But I think in an environment like that is not very friendly, if you fall in the ice, fall in the ice or really cold water, you can't just stay at home and be really cautious about things. I think I felt that people just learn to live with that, learn to live with the obstacles and the environment that they were dealing with.
They learned from their parents.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good point,
Wonderful.
Richard.
In the interest of time, and these stories are memorable for sure. I would like to ask Ed Miller to tell us what it was like flying with Bob and how important trust is, and with your time as Bob's co-pilot. But all of you have talked about trust and self-reliance as central to your QLF experience. And for you, what did that mean, Ed? And then we'll move over to the rest of you.
I think it actually fits some of what we've been talking about in the last few minutes, the whole question about swimming and drowning. And it was an inherently risky environment and a dangerous environment. And the winter I spent there, I'll get back to the plane in a minute, but the winter I spent there as a priest in charge, I went out in the wintertime in the boats. They were out seal fishing. And I scratched my head looking back on that today and said, there is no way in the world that I would do that now. And there was no way in the world that anybody was going to survive more than a minute or two if anything happened. This is before the days of survival suits, at least, and dry suits and things before they were at least commonly available. And so I think in addition to the hospitality, and this gets the plane in a second, which we were all the great beneficiaries of, living in an inherently dangerous environment where you were always living on the edge, and living in places where you couldn't control everything, and you couldn't control life, and how you lived with that, and sometimes with resignation, sometimes simply with endurance, sometimes with depression, was part of that experience. And in a particular way, I had that experience with Bob in the plane. The years I was there were the early years when Bob had the Helio Courier, and that was a great comfort because it was sold and designed and sold and built as a very safe airplane. Now, it happened to be a very tricky plane to fly, and it happened to be flown in places Bob would take it. So to be as crash resistant for the passengers as it was a good thing, because lots of them crashed. And that's the Cessna, but that's okay. So it was comforting to be in a plane that was built solidly, even though it was hard to fly. And then it was reassuring to know that Bob knew how to do that. He was one of the key Helio pilots and often sought after for demonstrations. And I know every year at the fall seaplane flying in Greenville, Maine, he got in these contests with other pilots. They'd empty the plane, put about 2 gallons of fuel in, and see who could take off the fastest and do all sorts of things. But he was very, very accomplished. So that was a reassuring as well. And so you had trust in the plane, trust in Bob, and somehow trust in my world as it emerged, some sense of God's presence in the midst of this, because I knew, just like the people in the boats, I knew that if we were flying from Harrington, let's say, to Northwest River, and something happened, Bob had all sorts of survival gear and food and guns to shoot whatever animals there were around and that sort of thing. And some early, fairly rudimentary search rescue beacons, chances of being found were probably pretty slim if we'd ever had a problem. And as I said at his funeral, the Psalm 139 comes to mind quite frequently. If I take the wings in the morning, that is about God, you are there. If I go to the uttermost, dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, you are there. That sense that God wasn't necessarily going to protect us and get us out of our foolishness if there were foolish mistakes, but God was around wherever we were. And as you know, some of that land was called the land God gave Cain, which was not a very hospitable description. And so it was that combination. And I learned some of, in a broader sense, that was true of people who were living in all areas there. Life on the edge and in rapidly changing times. Could I add one more comment, Beth, in
Sure.
this general thing? Because I think not only was it risky and sometimes dangerous, but that mid to late 60s was a period of great transitions. And, the hospitality was jeopardized a little bit by, Richard mentioned the TV. And the TV, as a TV emerged, it was more difficult for people simply to come over and sit and talk and in the community. And they started to sit and watch TV instead. So there was a certain element in which community was diminished a little or put at some risk. Tremendously rapidly changing times, at least in the Quebec area with the separatist movement. Some of you remember that in the late 60s, the Parti Québécois and René Lévesque and all that sort of stuff. And so there was, and the the rule that you had to do everything in French, which for the people on the English communities in the coast was a real threat. So there were lots of things going on, changes in QLF. We can go to that later if you want to, Beth, but there was a rapidly changing time as well. And people's ability to adapt, because life wasn't always in their control, was a key element in, and also the fisheries declining and the subsidies and that sort of thing.
Right. Thank you so much. And I want to turn now to Candy. You've talked about how important it was that Bob believed in you and trusted in you. This is something we've heard from so many people, and what a difference that made for you.
Yeah, and before I go there, I'd like to just say to Philip, you're right, cavalier was the wrong word, and building on what Ed said is I didn't really have much concept of church or faith until I got to the coast, and I trailed around after Bob a couple of summers taking pictures for him, and when he ended up in Wolf Bay and giving a service in a little town, in a little house with some people, I don't know, it just all of a sudden came to me, okay, I get what faith means. I mean, as Ed said, this is a really rough environment, and how are you going to get through without going nuts? I mean, the whole concept of faith, really, I learned that from Bob and watching him give these services to a few people in a house and going from place to place. And it was quite a lesson for me. I don't know that it made me any more religious, but I understood it better than I ever had before. And moving on to what it did for me, I was kind of a indifferent student. I didn't have a lot of confidence. And all of a sudden I get dropped into a town and basically said, okay, you want to do something with these kids? Use your imagination, you figure it out, I'll be back. And it was the first time in my life where I'd ever had to draw on what I had learned and be responsible for all these kids. And I don't know, I think it actually changed my outlook on myself and the way I wanted to spend my future, because I think Bob gave to a lot of indifferent students like me, showed us that we could actually take responsibility and do something. And that was really important. Life-changing, actually.
Sure. Thanks so much. Now to a few final remarks, and I'd like to turn this to Philip, if you'd like to comment on where you see hope in this world of pandemics and climate change, and where you see hope from the perspective of QLF and what we can do to make a difference.
Wow, that's a loaded question. Well, just let me say this. I don't know about self-reliance. When I think of self-reliance, I think of people on the coast, and you had to be self-reliant. I mean, you built your own boats, you built your own homes, you took care of your families, you made a living and that sort of thing. And I think that if I may piggyback on what Ed said about TV, my sense is that that's really changed now. And to a large extent, QLF has, I think, more relevance today than it ever had, in the sense that with the mission of QLF and with community-based conservation and the work that Kath Blanchard has done with species at risk and so on, that's all very relevant to the people on the coast. I don't know about if people would say it's all throughout all communities, but it's certainly true in my mind about certain communities. And I think that's going to stand them in good stead. I think we will get through this pandemic. I think it's been a terrific disruption in our lives. In some respects, maybe it's a good pause to have, not just for people on the coast, but for all of us. I know it's been for me at least. And so I'm hopeful. I think that, there's a role for QLF to continue in our home region. I think when I think of the longevity of QLF in our home region, people have come and gone, politicians have come and gone, ministers have come and gone, people, agents of change, teachers and so on have come and gone. But QLF has really stayed the course, I think. And it's a great tribute to Bob Bryan and to the organization and to all, not just we're a small segment of the people who really went and volunteered and interacted with people. And I think that that'll continue.
Thanks so much, Philip. And Ed, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, but I want to make a quick aside first, if I may, about Candy. And one of Bob's sort of more curious efforts was to send Candy and me, we never met, I don't think, to St. Anthony to take photographs of the new hospital. And you've mentioned a couple of times Come From Away, which many of you know is now the name of the show, from 9/11, when all the planes landed in Gander and people stayed. So I can't think of that. I've seen the show twice. I can't think of it without thinking that the only time I've been to Gander was with Candy. And we got stuck in Gander too for 2 or 3 days, as I recall. Remember that, Candy? And if only we'd written a play, we could be rich and famous today.
That's right.
No, we're back. We're back at now where I sort of began, where we began. It's curious. Philip mentioned the pandemic, and here we are on Zoom and electronic communication. And in 1975, the winter when I was there in the church, that's how we communicated, by radio. It wasn't as sophisticated as this, but we had the sked every day. And thanks to the Love family, who had given radios to all the churches on the coast and some of the lay people, we talked twice a day on the sked. And it wasn't particularly confidential because a lot of people could listen in, but we had the frequency. But it was the way we kept in touch. And it's sort of that's the beginning. And I'm getting used to Zoom, but it's not that different from twice a day on the sked, comparing notes with the people in the other communities, both the clergy and the lay people. I think sometimes people do, and I'm glad Philip said what he just said, but sometimes people say, well, what's happening at QLF and what's happened? And people wonder if it hasn't lost its roots. It's no longer a regional organization, but global, no longer primarily high school students or early college students, no longer focused primarily on children, but on all generations and on other kinds of activities. And I would actually suggest that QLF continues to be absolutely based on its roots, as Philip has said. First of all, from the beginning, geographical boundaries were pushed, whether it was Bob in the plane or us going to places we'd never been ourselves. At the very beginning, it was mostly on the Quebec North Shore, but that changed pretty quickly. Newfoundland, Labrador, New Brunswick, Maine. The airplane may have been the symbol of that push beyond boundaries, but now there's simply different ways of pushing beyond geographical boundaries globally. We remember, as has been pointed out, there were no phones, often no electricity, no quick or easy way to communicate beyond a village other than by mail or by getting on the boat and visiting. There were severe limitations on reaching beyond the horizon. And now there's instantaneous linkage virtually anywhere in the world. So we haven't lost our roots in that respect at all. What's common in every place has in common, to some extent, this same continuing living on the edge. What's life like today, and what is it going to be like tomorrow? What do we fear about losing? What can we embrace about something hopeful? How do we live on the edge and in times of great transition in communities and a world that's at risk? And it seems to me that's pretty much where we started, where Bob started with us. So to me, QLF continues in its own way to help create that better world in this wonderful blend and mixture of giving and receiving, of teaching and learning, of growing together. And that's why I think this is such a great occasion, both to think back and recall what was in the past, but also to have a sense that what we remember by perpetuating our roots is, and I phrase a little differently, community, commerce, and culture, all elements of sustainability. So I hope the collaboration today has been helpful, both in recalling the past through memories and also in recovering those key elements created by Bob, the founder, that have been carried on through the leadership of Larry Morris and now through the wonderful leadership of Beth Allen.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'd like a copy of that.
Oh, people ask me for photographs and it takes years to get them, and copies of stuff, and it takes years. So I'll try to be quicker. Yes, Candy, I'll get some photographs too.
Well, thank you all. We have a few minutes left, and I again want to thank all of our guests, and also thank you, Ed, for your footage, and Candy for your photos from your collection, and a special thanks to our staff for their many contributions on this series. Alex Morris, Bill Steelman, Chase Delano, Liza Elliott, Kevin Porter, Casey Riley, and Alexa Schubach. And now, on behalf of QLF, I'd like to acknowledge one of our distinguished guests here, who as a former volunteer won the hearts and minds of the people and communities in which he served and the governing boards with whom he served. That individual is Philip Nadeau, who retires from the QLF Canada Board of Directors on April 29th, his last meeting.
Oh, darn.
Philip has served on the board for decades, with 15 years as chairman. Philip deserves our recognition for his service with distinction. A champion for this organization over decades, Philip has embraced QLF's program mission, believing in our purpose and relevance in years past and today, and our promise for the future. Always an ambassador, Philip has traveled with QLF staff numerous times to visit and meet with our alumni and partner organizations across Eastern Canada, Belize, and Europe. Philip attended the 2006 Congress in Budapest, Hungary, providing an inspiring invocation written by Bob Bryan and Trish Peacock for the opening night dinner, attended by 200 alumni representing 30 countries. And he presented at the 2016 QLF Congress in Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain. Over the years, Philip has attended every QLF reception to celebrate a milestone event in the organization's history, and has attended every US board meeting, which I know the US board appreciates. While Philip's commitment to QLF is exemplary, most important is that Philip has always been there for us to lend a hand, provide wise, thoughtful, encouraging advice when needed most. Philip, this is your time, a new beginning, a new chapter in your life, one that is well-deserved. We wish we could be with you to applaud and celebrate your service with QLF. For now, I raise my glass in a virtual toast to you.
Here,
You're here.
Here.
We'll miss you terribly, but look out, we'll come find you in St. Paul's River and stay for a few months if that's okay.
Hey, temper with my shells, I mean.
And that is it for our episode today. Thank you for joining with us. This episode marks the conclusion of our first season. The second will resume in September. Meanwhile, stay well and stay in touch with us.
Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you, Beth.
You.
Beth,
Thanks all.
Many
good to see
thanks.
you all.